Hi. As we get older, we begin to ask ourselves what we're going to leave behind when we've gone. What will be the legacy we leave for our children and our grandchildren? And we're living in times when Christianity and especially evangelicalism is being redefined. So it's a time when it's good for us to ask ourselves some simple questions. And today I just want to ask three simple questions. The first question I want to ask is, what is my standing before God? And I want to suggest to you that before we begin to follow God, as scripture shows us that we are not in a good state, we're in a bad position in front of God. Without him, we are without hope. In Ephesians chapter 2, it says, once we were without God and without hope in the world. And many of you will know the parable of the lost son, that story about how the father-son went far away and completely wrecked his own life, and then eventually came back to his father. And his father, in the story that Jesus told, said, this son of mine was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. So the answer to the question, what is my standing before God, before we have a relationship with God? According to scripture, we are isolated, hopeless, lost and dead. But God, in his great grace and mercy, has chosen to respond to that, not with judgment or with justice, but with grace, mercy, and forgiveness. So in John chapter 3 and verse 17 we read, for God did not send his Son into the world to judge and condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. So all of that is really important as a foundation or a context for what I want to say today. In Ephesians chapter 2, we read there, even when we were dead and doomed, he saved us by his wonderful grace. And so the thing that's important to me today is simply this, that without God's grace, without God choosing to respond to me without judgment, then I would be annihilated. I would be dead and gone. I'm only still standing because of God's grace and his mercy and his forgiveness. The second thing I want to say is that I find myself privileged by birth and not by merit. And it's not a theological point I want to make here, it's just plain common sense. I was born a Brit. I have a Brit passport, and I was born into this Western world which is much wealthier and more privileged than many other parts of the world. I live in a country where the average wage is around £45,000 a year. I live in a world where the average wage is about £6,200 a year. And I work in Zambia where the average wage is about £2,000 a year. And that's for people who have jobs. And many people in Central Africa do not have jobs, so they survive on a much lower amount of money every year. Why am I surrounded by this privilege? It's not because of anything that I've done. It's simply that I was born here. And so I want to make the point that those of us who live in the Western world, whichever country that happens to be in, whether it's in Europe or North America or anywhere else, if we are born here, we didn't deserve to be born here. We were born here not by merit, but we're just privileged to be here. We're privileged by birth. And I want to suggest to you, because of that privilege and because of the way God's treated us, because of his mercy and his forgiveness, that puts us in a position of great responsibility. The scripture tells us that with privilege comes responsibility. And we live in an age when perhaps in the Western world we're more inclined to go towards protecting what we've got and pushing everybody else away, even cutting people off from the help that we have traditionally given them over the years. And this is something that concerns me deeply. In scripture in Luke chapter 12 it says, "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required." And that to me relates to those of us who are privileged because of the way God has treated us, and privileged simply by birth. That puts a great responsibility on our shoulders. So my second question is simply this: in the light of the above, how am I called to live? If I have this responsibility because of the privilege that I have, how should I live my life? Relative wealth gives me power over my own life and over the lives of others. It gives me choices that other people don't have. If we look in the book of Acts, we find that early believers had everything in common. When they began to follow Jesus, and it was tough in those days, they weren't born into privilege. They found out about Jesus, and it was a costly thing for them to follow him. But in those early days, the church took everything that they had individually and brought it and pulled it together. They lived as a community, and they did that for two reasons. They did it so that they could share what they had with each other. And in a way, it meant that when somebody was going traveling or going on mission, they could use those pooled funds to help sponsor people when they were serving God in other parts of the world, as it was then. But they also did it so that they could minister to the poor. They noticed around them those people who were in need and who had nothing, particularly people like widows, and they used that money so that those people could survive, so that they could care for them and show compassion for them. That was very important. And they were doing that because they wanted to follow the example of Jesus. Jesus calls us to take up our cross and follow him. This is another important factor in answering this question in the light of the privilege that I've been born into. How should I live my life? Well, the scripture says that I should take up my cross to follow Jesus. And that picture of taking up our cross when we follow Jesus is a picture of complete sacrifice, because when Jesus carried his cross, he was sacrificing his life for the sake of those around him. He was sacrificing his life completely for other people. And that's what we're called to do as well. What does taking up our cross and following Jesus look like today? It's a question that we could spend a lot of time looking at and thinking about, but today I just want to raise it as a question. It means to live completely sacrificial lives for the sake of others. And then we also see from scripture that serving the needs of others is serving Jesus himself. He gives very high credence to serving the least of these, as Jesus called them. So I want to read briefly from Matthew chapter 25. These are the words of Jesus. He says, "Therefore I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did nothing to look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." That's a very powerful challenge to those of us who are privileged. When we look around the world, to ask ourselves, what am I called to be? What am I called to do? Is it about protecting what I've got and pushing others away? Or is it about living sacrificially for the sake of others because we love our precious Jesus? So my third question and final question is simply this: what will the legacy be that I leave for my grandchildren? Will they say, "He taught me how to get rich"? Or will they say, "He taught me how to live for the poor"? Will they say, "He taught us how to fight for our rights"? Or will they say, "He taught us how to fight for the rights of those with no voice"? Will they say, "He taught us how to protect our borders"? Or will they say, "He taught us how to cross borders, to live for those with nothing to give back"? God help us.